When a creature costs 7 mana, you really expect something impactful, since it typically takes a while to amass that much mana, and most of the time 7 mana creatures deliver. Either because they are huge and imposing, have good abilities, or both. However, not all 7 mana creatures give you what you deserve for gathering up so many resources. In fact, some of them are so bad that spending 7 mana on them is a good way to lose a game of Magic. And that's what we're going to look at in this video, the 10 worst 7 mana creatures ever printed. This video is sponsored by Card Kingdom. Use the links in the description to visit their store. At number 10, I've got Pale Wayfarer. For 5 generic and 2 white, it's a 4/4, which is a horrendous starting point, and one we're going to see a lot of on this video, but at least the Pale Wayfarer's text box is all upside, right? And yeah, it is, because you can pay 2 generic and 2 white and untap it to give target creature protection from the color of its controller's choice until end of turn. That's right, that's an untap symbol. That's a little used mechanic from Lorwyn Shadowmoor, one that is actually kind of cool, but you know what's not cool? Putting the ability on a creature that it's very hard to tap naturally. Your 7 mana 4/4 isn't exactly going to be attacking effectively. Now there is one thing to keep in mind that does allow this to only come in at number 10, and that is that you can attack with the Wayfarer with mana up, and if you do that, your opponent probably doesn't have a great block for this thing. Since you can use the Wayfarer's ability to give it protection, either to make it unblockable for that turn, or to make it so whatever blocks it doesn't do any damage to it. That might sound exciting, but think about the massive mana investment required to get you there. You'll have spent 11 mana to attack with a 4/4, and that's absolutely miserable. And even if you do find a way to otherwise tap the Wayfarer, like with Convoke, its ability is still way too expensive. Just imagine that the ability always lets you pay 4 mana to give protection to something. That would be a bad card because of the cost of the creature and the cost of the ability, and in most ways this is worse, since it requires so much additional setup to get to the point where it can even use its ability. Most of the time, the Wayfarer feels like a 7 mana 4/4 with no abilities, and that's a terrible card, but it does still have a higher ceiling than anything else on the list, which should tell you something about the quality of the cards in front of it. At number 9, I've included 2 cards. This is because they are both awful 7-drop creatures from the same set, and they have the same problem. Those cards are Jedit, Ojanen, and Sivitri, Scarzam. Legends is one of the most important sets in the history of Magic because it introduced both multicolor cards and legendary permanents, 2 things that are part of the very fabric of the game we play today, but just because that set introduced those things doesn't mean the actual execution was good. It feels like a really bad beta test for both legendary permanents and multicolored cards for the most part, and that's kind of what it was. This is because the way they statted multicolored creatures doesn't make any sense, and this is the most pronounced with vanilla legendary creatures like Jedit, Ojanen, a 5/5 that costs 4 generic, a blue, and 2 white, and Sivitri Scarzam, a 6/4 for 5 generic, a blue, and a black. It's like they thought being legendary or multicolored was upside, when the reality is that both things are downside for the most part. You need to be playing a 2-color deck with good mana to cast these at all, and once you go through all the trouble to do it, all you get is creatures that are understated, even for 1994. And when Legends released, legendary creatures were restricted to 1 per deck, as if running them was some amazing power play, but the reality is that all of the vanilla Legends in this set are bad, and these 2 are perhaps the worst of them all, and certainly the worst 7-drop Legends in the set. At number 8, it's Mold Demon. For 5 generic and 2 black, it's a 6/6. It's one of 2 7 mana 6/6s on the list, and that's the most efficient stat line we'll be seeing, which tells you a lot about how bad the power and toughness of 7-drop creatures on this list is. But Mold Demon's text box is largely downside because when it enters, you have to sacrifice it unless you give up 2 swamps. A vanilla 7 mana 6/6 is bad enough, but this one punishes you for casting it by making you lose 2 lands. Now, there are some decks that can turn losing those lands into upside. However, there are countless better ways to give up lands for actual value. I mean, cards like Zurin Orb exist, and that doesn't even cost you any mana to get a way to sacrifice lands on the board, and that's just one example. So there's no reason to play this 7 mana 6/6 with this effect, since you're certainly not going to be getting any good value when you cast this thing and put a couple of lands into the bin. At number 7, it's Bronze Horse. For 7 generic mana, it's a 4/4 with Trample. That's a pretty rough starting point, but it has another ability. As long as you control another creature, you prevent all damage that would be dealt to this creature by spells that target it. Yeah, that upside does not amount to much. Sure, your opponent can't kill your Bronze Horse with Roast or similar spells that target a creature and do damage, but the fact you have to control another creature for this ability to be active in the first place is super annoying, since it's not like the ability is good to begin with. After all kinds of spells can still kill this horse, and because it's an artifact, there are even more destroy effects that can do the job. Adding insult to injury, sweepers like Wildfire can still kill this thing, since it only prevents damage from targeted removal. Basically, the upside on this card is useful in a very narrow number of situations, and it's nowhere near enough upside to make up for the fact that you spent 7 mana on a 4/4 Trampler. At number 6, it's Elder Spawn. For 4 generic and 3 blue, it's a 6/6, making it tied with Mold Demon for the best stat line on the list, and it can't be blocked by red creatures. But at the beginning of your upkeep, unless you sacrifice an island, you sacrifice Elder Spawn, and it deals 6 damage to you. So the upside here is that it can't be blocked by red creatures. That's very narrow and unimpressive. Sure, against a mono red deck, this thing can never be blocked, but it's not protection, which would be way better. So red decks can still interact with this in any number of ways. Furthermore, this is a 7 mana card that's meant to hate on red decks, which will have you burnt to a crisp before you ever cast this horrible creature. At number 5, it's Mishra's War Machine. For 7 generic mana, it's a 5/5 and it comes with banding, which means it can attack with other creatures with banding and up to 1 creature without banding. And if a creature with banding or a group of creatures with a creature with banding in them is blocked or being blocked, you get to divide your opponent's combat damage instead of your opponent. So it's upside for sure, but not always relevant, especially when the creature you're using is a 7 mana 5/5. I mean, if you don't have some other creatures to join the band, your opponent simply blocking this with a 6/6 or bigger, or attacking with it with a 6/6 or bigger, nullifies banding entirely. Plus, the rest of the War Machine's text box is downside. At the beginning of your upkeep, it deals 3 damage to you, and you tap it unless you discard a card. So yeah, the upside does not match the downside here. If you're interested in discarding cards, you can sometimes find a way to take advantage of that part of this card, but there are so many ways to discard cards whenever you want in Magic, and there's no reason to run a creature like this one with way below rate stats and a really narrow window where it lets you discard a card, not to mention a massive punishment if you don't discard. You basically have to hold on to a card in your hand or Mishra's War Machine just shuts down, and that's not going to be worth it 99% of the time. Fun fact, a few years later in Urza's Destiny, Masticore was designed as a good Mishra's War Machine, and you can see how far they had to go to make a creature that forces you to discard during your upkeep that's actually worth it. Masticore is a much more efficient 4 mana 4/4 and it has 2 powerful abilities. It can machine gun opposing creatures by pinging them, and it can regenerate. Once you have a creature that is this efficient, that can just kill opposing creatures with mana, it actually makes sense to have to discard a card every turn to keep it around, and for a time, Masticore was arguably the best creature in the game, but it's like 1,000,000 times more powerful than its progenitor, Mishra's War Machine. If you want to know more about Masticore, I do have a whole video about that card. At number 4, it's Elder Landworm. This card has so much potential, especially because these days it has 2 super popular creature types, Dragon and Worm, but it's a white card, so that's kind of weird, and they made this card truly terrible. For 4 generic and 3 white, it's a 5/5 with Trample. At least that's better than Bronze Horse, right? Wrong, because Elder Landworm also has Defender. And come on, it's not like a 7 mana 5/5 Trample would be good anyway, but this has the massive downside on top of everything else. It can lose Defender, but only once it blocks. So, if you can block with the Worm and have it survive combat, your opponent better watch out because your 7 mana 5/5 Trampler is going to be unleashed. Of course, the Worm's ability to survive combat against similarly costed creatures is very limited, and even if it does kill something when it blocks, your opponent isn't remotely concerned about this gaining the ability to attack, since the stats are so bad. At number 3, it's Shrouded Serpent. For 4 generic and 3 blue, it's a 4/4, and its text box is 100% upside. When it attacks, any player can pay 4 generic, otherwise it becomes unblockable until end of turn. So yeah, another 7 mana 4/4, and while this one has upside, it is pretty minimal. I mean, imagine if this card was always unblockable. How good would that card be? Well, it'd still be pretty freaking bad since the stat line is that much of a problem, and this is way worse than that, because it won't even be unblockable a big chunk of the time, and unblockable is a super all or nothing ability. It's not like you can feel good about making your opponent pay the mana, because if they do, they can probably just block it with a bigger creature and kill it so you go down a card and they don't. And the times when they don't pay the mana, it's because they don't really care about taking 4 damage. This is going to feel like a 7 mana 4/4 with no upside most of the time, and that's just brutal. At number 2, it's Veldrane of Sengir. For 5 generic and 2 black, it's a 5/5, and it comes with an activated ability for 1 generic and 2 black, which lets it gain Forest Walk, but it also gets -3, -0 until end of turn. So he's got bad stats, and his only ability makes him unblockable, but only if your opponent controls a forest, and he also shrinks himself and becomes a 2/5 to become unblockable. Veldrane makes Shrouded Serpent's evasive ability look like the best thing ever. It's a real bummer that they didn't let the ability just give him Forest Walk and not debuff him, so he's only doing 2 damage at a time. That wouldn't have broken the card at all, even back in Homelands. Even against the ideal opponent, someone who has forests, Veldrane isn't going to be a creature that they are remotely concerned about because you have to sink so much mana into him, and he's so slow at doing damage that deciding to give him Forest Walk and getting in for 2 with him every turn is a good way to lose a game of Magic while your opponent uses their resources to, like, I don't know, actually add things to the board and do way more damage to you. And at number 1, it's Karplusan Giant. For 6 generic and a red, it's a 3/3, giving it the worst stat line on this list of creatures with awful stat lines. The good news is, you can improve its stats, but the cost of doing so is massive. You can tap an untapped snowland to give it +1/+1 until end of turn. So sure, if you're playing a deck with all snowlands, and you probably should be to get the maximum value out of this amazing card, that does mean this can threaten to attack as a 9/9 on the next turn, but the cost of doing that is that you don't get to add to the board at all because you tapped all your lands just to buff your creature. And it's not like the Giant comes with any built-in effect that makes it difficult to block. It can be chump blocked all day long, and it's also not difficult to remove, so you end up taking a massive tempo hit when you do what this card wants you to do, which is tap a bunch of snowlands, so you're probably just going to lose the game if your plan is to try and buff Karplusan Giant. And that's what I think makes it the worst 7-drop creature in the history of Magic. So, those are my picks for the worst 7-mana creatures in Magic. If you want to own any of these cards because, I don't know, you want to prove me wrong or something, check out the description where you can find a direct Card Kingdom link for each card that appeared in the video. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you want to catch up on past videos, including more that look at the worst cards ever printed, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.